Hey, what's up, guys? Hello, for Football Talk here. We started talking about the biggest needs for every NFL team already last week with the NFC side of things. Now we switch conferences and break down the biggest areas of improvement for these 16 AFC teams. That is according to my evaluations of their rosters and going through some of the tape. We will go division by division and give every squad its time individually, so we don't just talk about the same teams every single time. You can later check out my video on the NFC or read through my write-up of this to get even more detail. So let's start out with the AFC North. In division I go alphabetically, and to figure all these needs out, I went through roster construction, some of the additions and subtractions to all of these rosters, and the positions I considered as well, talking through them a little bit, what might be the areas of these teams that they can improve upon. Plus, how did I end up with the specific position that I listed here. And the first team is the Baltimore Ravens. And right off the bat, I'll be honest, it was kind of hard to find a hole on this team. They were 14-2 for a reason last season. And while it will be hard to replicate that kind of record, of course, they might actually be suited better to compete for the AFC this season. They did lose a Hall of Fame offensive guard in Marshall Yanda. And obviously there's no one player that can directly replace him. Some other players they lost in free agency, a run plug-in nose tackle Michael Pierce, and maybe the best inside backer from a year ago in Patrick Nwosu. However, I think with the moves they have made in the draft and free agency, plus a couple of trades, they might actually be better at most of those spots. When you look at the guard position, you look at a guy like Ben Bredesen, who they drafted out of Michigan in the 4th round, and another offensive lineman in Tyree Phillips out of Mississippi State who has some guard tackle flexibility. Plus, they also signed DJ Fluker just a couple of weeks ago, who has that flexibility as well. Now they have a really nice positional battle to see who will start out for them. Also, with Pierce gone, I think Brandon Williams can move back towards his more natural position at the nose. And as far as inside linebackers go, the Ravens drafted in the 1st round LSU's Patrick Queen and then Ohio State's Malik Harrison, who I think complement each other really well. Harrison more of a thumping Mike backer that can allow Queen to play on the weak side and roam around a little more. So I think that match will be better than what they had last season. Plus, to go with that on the defensive line, they did trade peanuts basically for Calais Campbell, signed Derek Wolfe. I think they will be better up front altogether in that front 7 defensively. So to me, the one thing that still stood out to me for this team that they could still add is that true speedball off the edge. I think Matt Judon finally received some of the recognition he deserves last season with a Pro Bowl nod. And the Ravens like some of the young guys they have, like a Tyus Bowser or a Jalen Ferguson. So they are still looking for those guys to grow. But when you look at what defensive coordinator Wink Martindale wants to do, especially on 3rd downs, all those heavy pressure looks, have everybody around the line of scrimmage, confuse the offense, who's coming, who's dropping out. That's the way they create pressure. But I think just having that one guy who can consistently threaten off the edge with his speed will give them another element, force quarterbacks to step up and just be more effective that way, especially on base downs as well. Next up, you have the Cincinnati Bengals, the team who just picked 1st overall. The obvious choice you look at this roster for me would have been linebacker, because you just look at who they bring back. There's really nobody there other than Jermaine Pratt of any notice. But they did draft 2 guys I really like in Wyoming's Logan Wilson and Appalachian State's Akeem Davis-Gaither. Plus later on they also acquired Marcus Bailey from Purdue. So with that in mind, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt here and see how those pieces are being put together. Cincinnati also finally started spending some money in free agency, bringing in a really underrated defensive lineman in DJ Reader, who will free up some of those other guys. A safety in Von Bell, who I think matches really well with the rangy Jesse Bates at free safety. And then they also brought in a couple of corners to go with William Jackson, who I think is a rising star if he can stay healthy and get his game back together. When I look at the offensive side of things, if AJ Green can come back healthy, I think they also have a really good group of skill position players, as long as John Ross can give them anything. All of that surrounding Joe Burrow with those weapons, I think he's set up pretty well. But the one area I think they still need to improve is the offensive line. It's been a problem child for a while now. We will finally see their 1st round pick from a year ago in Jonah Williams, who was my number 1 tackle in the draft, coming out of Alabama. I think Trey Hopkins kind of set in there as the center. But those 2 guard spots are really up in the air for me. When you look at guys like Michael Jordan and Billy Price, who they acquired in the draft the 2 previous seasons, Both those guys really had their struggles in their first and second year, respectively. Cincinnati also brought in Xavier Su'a-Filo, who was a pretty good backup for Dallas these last couple of years, having kind of an up-and-down start with the Texans. And they did select Hakeem Adeniji out of Kansas, who possibly could move inside and has some real nice athleticism for the position. You look at that right tackle spot with Bobby Hart. I don't know what they see in him. He's still penciled in as the starter, I think, here. I don't think that he's really done anything to deserve that, but we'll leave him out of the way and concentrating more on those guard spots. Because for Joe Burrow, what really made him successful at LSU last season was the pocket integrity he had, the ability to step up and operate the pocket all the time. I think he can deal with pressure off the edge, reducing that shoulder and stepping up into the pocket. But when he is push up the middle, I think that could be a problem for him. So securing the inside of the pocket, making room for Joe Mixon in the run game, and allowing Burrow to step up, I think that will be the biggest priority here. Then you have the Cleveland Browns, and as I talked already about in my recap of the draft, there are definitely some things you can question about this Browns front office and how they handle things, but they just put together a really nice class of rookies. I'm a big fan of what they did investing into the offensive line, bringing in former Titans tackle Jack Conklin for the right side, and then drafting Jedrick Wills 10th overall, who was my top-rated tackle. Those two going with an already really good interior line. I think they all just went from one of the weaker lines last season to a real strength now. Their assortment of skill position players is challenging for one of the best in the league as well. And when you look at that defense, there's a lot of things to like as well. Ferocious defensive line potentially. On the back end, those corners of Denzel Ward and Greedy Williams coming into the second season. Also bringing in Carl Joseph to complement their second rounder, Grant Delpit out of LSU. I really like what they are building. The one unit I'm just not sure about yet is the linebacker corps, because they did lose Joe Schobert and Christian Kirksey in free agency. A guy I really thought was a big steal for them last season was Malk Wilson, was a day 3 pick in the draft, and really was their most promising linebacker to me, and I think that's a big reason they did decide to move on for those guys. Another guy they brought in actually earlier, Sione Takitaki, formerly out of BYU. He's a guy they like a lot as well, and those two really matched. So I think for Wilson, it's best to stay on the weak side actually, where he can just shoot gaps and play a little more freely. He's still speeding up his mental processing, and then you have Takitaki, whose physical play fits best at the strong side because he did play on the edge quite a bit before moving off the ball in his final season there. Wilson could probably play Mike or Will, but to me, weak side would be best for him, so that leaves the Mike spot. And I think they believe they have the solution there, but I'm just not sold on it. In the third round, they did bring in LSU linebacker Jacob Phillips, but he was way down my board and probably was their worst pick for me, because when you look at him, he has a really conservative style of play, and to me, he's just not the missing piece, because I think they need somebody who is aggressive and plays the run that way in that physical division. And the only guy he will really be in competition with is B.J. Goodson, who has some starting experience, but only played like a quarter of the snaps for the Packers last season, who weren't necessarily great at that linebacker unit either. So I think that's the one spot they could still use an experienced pro. And the fourth team in the North, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And when you look at them last season, offense and defense, it was just two completely different things. The defense was one of the elite units once Minkah Fitzpatrick came over and really took care of that secondary. That front seven really got after people. And first I looked, maybe they could add a couple of pieces to the linebacker corps at that positions, because they did lose Mark Barron. But then looking at that draft, they did bring in Maryland's Antoine Brooks Jr., who is listed as a safety, but I think is a very similar play to what Barron presented. Could potentially make the full-time transition to linebacker, or at least definitely will play there on sub-packages. So I'm fine with that. Offensively, they did bring in a couple of other receivers now, and I think the way they do it, how they develop receivers there, I trust in the way they're going to use all those different pieces. So instead, what really, to me, broke their neck last season was the injury to Ben Roethlisberger, and nobody really stepping up behind him. When you look at a Mason Rudolph, I said it early on in the season when they put him out there, and he put up okay numbers. They were just not letting him play, really, using all those different shallow crosses, screen passes, quick dump outs to the backs. As soon as he needed to actually push the ball downfield a little, he really struggled. And then you look at Devlin Hodges, who had some nice flashes early on, won them that game against the Chargers, and took over as a starter winning 3 straight games. But then he did toss 4 interceptions versus the Bills, and they lost the final 3 games of the season. So I don't think the coaches really want to see him out there either anymore. The Steelers also brought in a former first-round pick in Paxton Lynch of the Broncos. So maybe he will show some of that potential that got him drafted that high. But I just don't think they have anybody on the roster who can steer the ship if Big Ben is out again. So I think they really need to add somebody who can secure this season, because I think they have a really good roster actually, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Some weapons on offense, a really good offensive line still. But when you don't have that guy who can pull the trigger for you, it's a tough task. Alright, let's move on to our next division, and it's the AFC East, starting out with the Buffalo Bills. And looking at this Bills team, I already thought they were set up for success because of the coaching staff and some of the pieces they've put on the roster. However, now bringing in Stephon Diggs in the trade and some of the picks they made in the draft, I really like their chances to win this division actually. You look at the receiver position being the real need coming into the offseason, but now with Diggs coming in, a couple of guys they brought in the draft, and a Gabe Davis from UCF, and an Isaiah Hodgins from Oregon State. They all of a sudden went from one of the weaker receiving corps to actually one of the better ones in the league, because John Brown is the number 2 and then Cole Beasley in the slot to go with those rookies. I think that's a pretty good core. When I looked at it, yeah, offensive guard, they could maybe add another piece or a corner potentially, depending on how Josh Norman can recover in this zone-heavy scheme that should work to his advantages. They're also counting on a guy in Dawson Knox, who they drafted last season, to really take that next step at the tight end position. And I really liked him a lot more than most people last year in April. I didn't really look at either side of the ball having a major hole. Instead, I looked at the special teams, and in particular the punter situation, because Corey Bujorquez, he only averaged 41.9 yards per punt last season, which was 29th among starters, and only 3 guys had a higher touchback percentage than him at 8.9%. When you have a team that has close to an elite defense, that values field positioning, you just don't want a team to rank in the bottom 10 in terms of punt return average allowed either. Obviously, that isn't just a stat about the punter, but also how you cover your kicks. But you don't want those stats to be near the bottom all around, because you look at this Buffalo offense, they will probably try to grind away some games with a duo of third-round running backs in Devin Singletary out of FAU in 2019, and then now Zach Moss this year coming out of Utah. To me, just a lot of this team will have to come down to how a third-year quarterback in Josh Allen can mature, and if he can come through for them in the national spotlight, because they do all of a sudden have 4 primetime games this season. This team clearly has an identity, and I think as little as a difference as a punter can make for some teams, for Buffalo in particular, it can be a big impact because it complements the way that they play. Next up are the Miami Dolphins. When you look at teams like the Cardinals, picking first overall in the draft just a year ago, and then the 49ers going from picking right behind them to actually making an appearance in the Super Bowl, among those organizations that you would consider being in rebuild mode, I'm not sure if the Dolphins may be the furthest ahead in that transition, but they might be set up better than all those other teams. Obviously, the 49ers are not in rebuild mode anymore, if anybody wants to come at me with that. So for the Dolphins in particular, early on in last season, they seemed to be tanking for Tua. But even though they did struggle early on, they really showed some fight and the signs of being a culture being built by Brian Flores and company there. I've talked many times about Week 17 when they did defeat the New England Patriots, who were set up to earn a bye week in the playoffs. And they knocked those guys off. Rather meaningless for them, but I think it did a lot for their psyche, where they can go, despite the roster definitely having some issues. So they did all of that, and they still had the star quarterback out of Alabama fall right into their laps. Miami also spent a bunch of resources protecting their future signal caller. When you look at Austin Jackson, Robert Hunt, and some other guys they added in the draft. Also wide receiver Devontae Parker, he really emerged in the second half of 2019. And a lot was invested into retooling this Dolphins defense. Similar to what Flores experienced already in New England, he really wants to build that defense from the back to the front. So you look at that secondary, you already Xavier Howard there. Now you sign Byron Jones to the biggest contract for any corner. And with the 30th overall pick, you bring in Noah Ikpenagany out of Auburn, who can start in the slot right away, can continue to grow. He's still a young player and hasn't played the corner position for very long. So with that in mind, Miami could really have one of the premier quarterback trios in the league going forward. Dolphins also brought in another guy from New England, the veteran, in Eric Rowe. And they did draft, surprisingly somewhat, in the third round, Brandon Jones out of Texas, who I think isn't the perfect player at this point, but very smart, really works hard, and brings a lot of versatility to the table. I think he has all the traits and football acumen. If he can just clean up a little bit of that technique as a tackler, he can develop into a very good player for them. With all that being said, I still believe the Dolphins need that true free safety for all of this to work. After they traded away Minkah Fitzpatrick early on to Pittsburgh at the start of last season, looking at all those guys they have covering people and how aggressive Flores probably wants to be, calling cover 0 and cover 1, you still need that guy you can go single high with, someone who is an instinctive and rangy player back there, can clean some of those things up. When you look at Brandon Jones, he may have the ability to cover ground for that role, but his feel and deep coverage is still somewhat lacking here. He's still developing, so I'm not sure if it's perfect to put him back there and experience some of those growing pains right away. I think they'd be better suited to bring in a true free safety potentially still and let his versatility really shine. The reigning division champs, the New England Patriots, and to me it's kind of crazy for them to go from a 20-year dynasty to almost an afterthought overnight as Tom Brady decided to go to Tampa Bay. I certainly have my questions about this roster still myself, but they do still bring back several key pieces from last year's number 1 ranked defense, and they do have 2 of the better minds on either side of the ball with Josh McDaniels and then Bill Belichick, of course. Like I mentioned a few times now, the Patriots probably want to run the ball 35 plus times a game, not only because they have like 10 backs on the roster, or that they will have a first-year starter in Jarrett Stidham probably on the center, but also just they don't have a lot of outside threats at the receiver position. There are some areas on defense that could use some help, but I'm going to focus on the offensive side here, and especially some outside receivers, because you look at the slot and you still have a Julian Edelman who was banged up for most of last season, but should be in better shape now. They did trade a second-round pick for Mohamed Sanu mid-season last year. He looked more like a disappointing investment, but should be better this season. And then even an undrafted free agent who I like quite a bit and thought could play a role in Jacoby Myers, showing some signs as a rookie. New England did select N'Keal Harry out of Arizona State in last year's first round of the draft, but even he, evaluating his skill set, I thought he would be better suited to play inside as well. I know that the Patriots probably want to keep him on the outside, but I'm not sure if he really shows the ability to create separation vertically or at the top of his route all the time. When you look at what they did in free agency, bringing in Marquise Lee and Damiere Byrd, those guys have played very well in stretches when they were allowed to be on the field. But none of those guys really strike me as a true alpha who can just put an X and let him go to work, win those one-on-one matchups. I know that's not necessarily what McDaniels wants to do. He plays more of a matchup-based passing attack, but having that different type of pass catcher who has the size and the skill set to defeat press coverage, be a one-on-one target, I think it would just give them another dimension here. And the final team in the East, the New York Jets. And a couple of years ago, you could have argued that the Jets had the worst roster in the league. Last offseason was kind of crazy for them as well, firing the general manager Mike McCagnon after just spending over $200 million in free agency and running a draft. However, I did like them bringing in a promising young guy like Joe Douglas coming over from Philadelphia, and I'm on board with some of the moves they have made since then, especially putting together a really nice draft class just now. When you look at all those guys who will bring back, finally back from injury, CJ Mosley, who was a big signing in free agency last season, a pretty dynamic target at the tight end position, Chris Herndon, who just was suspended and then couldn't stay healthy last year, but really showed some flashes working with Sam Darnold the season before. So while there are definitely some areas to upgrade for them going forward, I think 3 positions in particular stand out to me. The right guard spot, then outside corner and edge rusher. And I think Brian Winters, he's a viable option on the interior of the O-line. And I really like the upside of one of the third-round picks in Cameron Clark coming out of Charlotte. Looking at the cornerback position, I thought they made a nice under-the-radar signing in Pierre Desir, who quietly was one of the better cover guys these last couple of years, even though nobody really talked about him. And then the 5th-round pick, Bryce Hall, is a guy I was a big fan of. Had him as a top 10 prospect. The position might have been even higher had he not been hurt. But depending on when he will be back to 100%, I think he has all the makeup to be a starter right away. So instead, I focused more on the edge rusher position, and that's really a dreaded group that the Jets really haven't had a true impact player since like John Abram maybe 15 years ago. They have Jordan Jenkins, who I think is a really solid run stopper at that Sam spot. And they did bring in several young talented players like Jordan Willis, who was once a second-round pick, Terrell Basham, who has some very intriguing physical attributes, and then Wyatt Ray, who once was a undrafted free agent, played with Harold Landry at BC, and I thought showed up at times as well on tape for me. The Jets also brought in Florida's Jabari Zuniga in the third round this year, and I talked about a couple of weeks, you can check that out as well. The former Memphis Tiger Bryce Huff, who I think could work his way into the rotation as well. Still, none of those guys are true bona fide pass rushers who they can just rely on to routinely beat offensive tackles. So maybe bringing in that one guy who can make things easier for everybody around would help them out a lot. So I think maybe it's not this year, but next year's target in the draft or free agency, bringing in that big-time pass rusher. I think that has to be the priority now. All right, let's talk about the AFC South, starting things out with the Houston Texans. And before we talk about anything else, no, this Texans offensive line is still not where I want it to be. At this time, 2 years ago, I called them the worst unit in the entire league. And heading into 2019, I said the Texans might struggle again just because the additions they did make were somewhat developmental rookies in Titus Howard out of Alabama State and then Max Sharping out of Northern Illinois. I like those players, but I didn't think they were ready to start right away. Trading for Laramie Tunsil from Miami was huge for this team, and they already secured into a long-term deal. Maybe might have overpaid a little bit, but having that true stud left tackle potentially, paying that hefty price, I can live with that, even though it definitely took them out of the market for even more help up front in the draft or in free agency. However, those two guys that they brought in the draft last year, I want to see how they do this year, how they put this offensive line together. Before I talk about them more, like everybody else, I seriously questioned the DeAndre Hopkins deal, of course, and I have to see Brandon Cook stay healthy before I really can talk about the receiver position. But assuming he can and Will Fuller potentially can finally stay on the field, I think they have enough weapons around Deshaun Watson to put up some points. So instead I'm looking at the defensive side of the ball and look at Houston. I think they might go to more even fronts this year because of the pieces they have brought in recently. They drafted one of my big crushes in Ross Blacklock out of TCU. You throw him into the mix, and I really like what they've put together in this front seven. In the secondary is where I definitely have some question marks still. Looking at the cornerback position, Bradley Roby was really the only guy who showed some consistent stretches for them last year. However, guys like Gary Conley and Lonnie Johnson, those two just have a lot of potential still to grow. And I really like John Reed, who they picked in the fourth out of Penn State. He will be competing with another first rounder and Vernon Hargraves for the starting nickel spot. So I think they definitely have the guys there that could fit in those roles if they just continue to develop. You have one of the better young safeties, and is pretty underrated himself, with Justin Reed, roaming the back end. But I think he needs a partner in crime. Reed can move around quite a bit, but free safety I think is his more natural fit. The Texans released Tashawn Gibson a few weeks ago, and now he looks like Eric Murray is probably the front runner for the starting spot, with names like Keon Cross and Jalen Watkins and others on that roster. None of those guys have proven to be true difference makers in the league to me, and I think another guy in the secondary to give them some stability would definitely help. Next up, the Indianapolis Colts, and I thought about this a little bit. It's really crazy to think Andrew Luck retired less than a year ago. My view on the entire Colts organization has changed a lot since then, of course, because I really liked what the general manager Chris Ballard has done to this roster. Similar to the Jets a couple of years ago, I thought they were one of the worst overall rosters in the entire league, but he has put a lot of talent on this team, and had Luck been there, I thought they would be a challenger for the AFC for years now. Still, as it pertains to this year in particular, I think they can make some noise, and they are my favorite to win the AFC South as of right now, because they were a challenger through the first half of 2019, and then the wheel kind of fell off as soon as Jacoby Brissett got hurt initially. Now they bring in a veteran in Phillip Rivers, and I thought he looked broken down a little bit last year. Probably his worst season with the Chargers. but he's not going from one of the worst offensive lines to playing behind one of the very best in the league. I also love the 2 second-round picks. You look at Jonathan Taylor, the running back out of Wisconsin. I really think he will run wild behind the offensive line. And then Michael Pittman, the receiver out of USC, who matches well with Phillip Rivers. He always liked to target those big-bodied wideouts. Defensively, I really like the addition of DeForest Buckner in the middle of that defense, and also some of the pieces they have around him. Kemoko Toure is a guy I looked at last year already as being a breakout player potentially. Was banged up for most of the year, but now he's coming back and could take that next step. Where I still have question marks is the secondary, because they did lose Pierre Desir in free agency, and even though they signed Xavier Rhodes, he has really been falling off a cliff recently. I just don't know what I'm getting here. Last year's second-round pick, Rock Ya-Sin, coming to the Temple, he really showed some excellent stretches of play, and I'm a big fan of him going forward. But to me, there's still some uncertainties about those outside corners. Even if Rhodes miraculously returns to more of his 2018 form, I'm just not sure who will line up on the opposite side of the field if they move Yasin more into the slot potentially. TJ Carey is by far the most experienced guy outside of Rhodes on this roster, but he did not look good at all in Cleveland last year. And Kenny Moore has been playing very solid for them these last 3 years as an undrafted free agent formerly, but he lacks some size to play on the outside as well. And then you have a guy like Quincy Wilson, who I liked a lot coming out of Florida, but he's never really developed into the player I hoped he could as this ultra-physical corner. So depending on what they want to do defensively with all those 2 high shells, cover 2, I'm not sure what they're going to do to transition more to single high coverages. Malik Hooker is still a very talented player, but just hasn't been able to put it all together. And I'm a big fan of their third-round pick, safety out of Utah, and Justin Blackmon. If they stay with this cover 2 heavy scheme, they may just need another big corner who won't shy away from tackling. Next up, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and looking at Vegas odds, they are projected to pick first overall come next April, with the lowest over-under at 4.5 as of right now. And I'm not saying they will surprise anybody, be a challenger really in the South, or anything like that, because they did lose a lot of pieces, definitely the 2 starting corners, Lita and Calais Campbell, some of the guys they have on the roster, openly talking about how they want to be traded. But people seem to forget, looking at this roster, they still have a lot of talent there. Their left tackle right now, Cam Robinson, he might be better suited to move inside, and they replace him at the tackle spot with somebody else. And some of those young pieces on defense, they still have to prove themselves. I'm not saying that they will be anything special this year right away, but Jacksonville has one of the more underrated receiving corps in the league, with DJ Chark being a breakout player last year, then Dede Westbrook being capable of putting up big numbers any single week, and now with a guy like Colorado's Laviska Shenault coming in with enormous potential, all those guys surrounding Gardner Minshew, they will give them a chance to evaluate what they have in that guy, and if he might take them out of the quarterback market potentially, who knows right now. So like I mentioned, no idea what's going on with Leonard Fournette and Yannick Ngakoue, those guys talking about how they want to get out. But I like some of the young linebackers they brought in these last couple of years in the draft, with Josh Allen a year ago and now Caleb Van Chasen out of LSU this April. Those 2 will give them one of the more dynamic 2-packs of edge rushers in the league going forward. Where I think they are furthest away from Saxonville that we were talking about just a few years ago is the back end. You look at the 9th overall pick, CJ Henderson coming out of Florida, he's a dog. And they're counting on his potential to give them another shutdown corner, similar to what they had in Jalen Ramsey. I liked Ronnie Harrison coming out of Alabama as a true strong safety in 2018, but they don't have that true roaming free safety to me. You look at Gerard Wilson, he's been playing quite well for them as an undrafted free agent these last couple of years. And then they brought in some guys like Josh Jones, Andrew Wingard, and then one of their day 3 picks in Daniel Thomas out of Auburn this year. All those guys are better suited to play around the line of scrimmage to me. Maybe see the Jacks go more to those quarters looks, where they can have those safeties on the hashes and really attack patterns, read those and drive on the ball. I still believe in one of their undrafted free agents in this year, J.R. Reed coming out of Georgia. I think he's a really solid player. But maybe they should add one more piece with some experience, because Ronnie Harrison is actually pretty much the real veteran with playing experience on the secondary, and he was just a draft pick in 2018. And finally for the South here, the Tennessee Titans, coming off their deepest playoff run with that AFC Championship game against the Chiefs. Really haven't been that far since that team was led by Steve McNair back in 2002. They got all the way to that point because of a bruising running game behind the league's leading rusher in Derrick Henry and a very opportunistic defense, I would say. Looking at what they did in the offseason, they're really trying to run it back with most of the starters staying in Nashville and the guys that did lose being replaced directly with some of the draft picks. Looking at them initially coming into the offseason, adding someone alongside Harold Landry coming off the edge was the biggest need for them they wanted to address. But they did take a swing in the former top 10 pick in Vic Beasley coming over from Atlanta. Then you look at the secondary. I think they made a big steal late in the second round of this year's draft in LSU cornerback Christian Fulton. And I believe he allows Mike Vrabel and that coaching staff to move Adoree Jackson back into the slot where I think he played his best. So I'm not sure if the Titans need a starting piece necessarily. Instead, I'm looking at the offensive line and the depth behind it. Now with the selection of a behemoth offensive tackle from Georgia and Isaiah Wilson at 29th overall, the Titans have Dennis Kelly and Tyson Brylow being backups, which is where they should be. That starting interior free as well. Last year's free agency additions in Roger Saffold, one of the more underrated centers in the league, in Ben Jones, and last year's third round in Nate Davis. They really give them bases to run the ball effectively, adding to those two aggressive tackles. But looking past those three starters on the inside, they just don't really have anybody who I would trust out there and not lose a beat. Jamil Douglas played by far the most on this roster with almost 40% of the snaps, but he definitely struggled out there, allowed 3 sacks and was flagged twice. Once again, the moves the Titans have made are basically direct replacements of the guys they lost in free agency, and they want to recapture that bottle of lightning they caught once Ryan Tannehill took over on the center last year. But to me, if that's what they want to do and how they want to be successful, they need to secure the strength of their team and not potentially take a big step backwards if somebody on that interior O-line goes down at some point. So adding a quality piece on the interior of the offensive line, I think that's the move they still need to make if they think that recipe for success can work again. And the final division for these breakdowns, the AFC West, starting out with the Denver Broncos. And these Broncos, they might be one of the more improved teams in the entire league, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They bring in Jerry Jeudy out of Alabama and then KJ Hamler with the first 2 picks of the draft. Early on, they free to select Albert Okwuegbunam out of Missouri, the former tight end for Drew Lock. In college, you add him to the mix with Cortland Sutton coming into year 3, really one of the rising stars in the league. Last year's first rounder, Noah Fant at the tight end position as well. And that team all of a sudden has a lot of firepower. Denver also continued to strengthen the offensive line with free agency additions Graham Glasgow coming over from Detroit and making a steal and third round pick Lloyd Cushenberry out of LSU, who I had as my 35th overall prospect. The one spot that still is a question mark for me is the left tackle spot where Garrett Bowles just saw his 5th-year option declined. To me, this is really a prove-it year for him to be able to show this skill set that he definitely has, but he hasn't been able to put it all together quite yet. Either way, no matter if Bowles plays poorly, you need to replace him, or one of those 2 starting tackles goes down with an injury. I'm not sure they have anybody on the roster they can put out there right away. Jake Rogers was a 7th round pick for Atlanta in 2015, and then Calvin Anderson was a pretty talented kid who went and drafted last year. Neither one of those guys gives me a great deal of confidence as for right now. When you look at the addition of Pat Shermer as the offensive coordinator, he will make things easy on his second-year quarterback, giving him some easy completions. But you saw what happened to him last year in New York, how that situation with 2 bad tackles really affected the plan there. Defensively for the Broncos, they basically replaced Chris Harris Jr. with AJ Bouye. They had another piece on the D-line with Terrell Casey, some talented players in the draft being brought in as well, and most importantly, Bradley Chubb coming back from the season-ending injury a year ago. I think if Bowles finally plays up to his potential and they can stay mostly healthy for the year, I don't really see a reason why these Broncos can't compete for the West, or at least be a pain in the you-know-what for the Kansas City Chiefs. And talking about the reigning Super Bowl champions, when you win the title and you bring back 20 of 22 starters from the year prior, that's a situation that is pretty much unheard of. The offense is still loaded with all those track stars, the premier receiving tight end in Travis Kelce, what I think is now universally regarded as the best player in football in Patrick Mahomes, just throwing piss missiles all over the field. That's a scary sight already. And then in the first round to add Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the running back out of LSU, I think it just gives them another element, runs with a chip on the shoulder, really punishes defenders. And I've talked about it a bit. You have all those guys going down the field, and then you have him as a check down, and he's just looking to run people over. Nobody will want to tackle this guy. But I want to focus more on the defense here. And towards the end of the year last season, that KC defense really stepped up with some timely stops in certain games and some big plays being made. The D-line has some dogs on it in Chris Jones and Frank Clark. And if second round pick Willie Gay Jr., if he can speed up his mental processing a bit, play as fast as he runs, I think he gives them a very rangy player on the second level, with Juan Thornhill coming back in his second year to go with the Honey Badger, and a really nice trio of cornerbacks in Rashad Fenton, Travaris Ward, and Bashard Breeland. I think they can be very happy with what they have in that starting five, basically. Plus, they still have Daniel Sorensen, who is a key special teams member for them. And in the fourth round, they bring in L'Jarius Sneed, a guy who has some corner safety flexibility, coming out of Louisiana Tech. But other than that, looking at the secondary, I'm not sure about the depth they have behind it. If one of those guys goes out, yes, Sorensen can fill in. And I recently talked about one of the undrafted free agents in Javaris Davis, the corner out of Auburn. I think he could have a role in sub packages early on. But when it comes to veterans and difference makers on the back end, I'm not sure what the Chiefs really have there beyond that starting lineup. So maybe they should still add one more established veteran to that room if they want to make a run at it again. Now let's get to the Las Vegas Raiders. And in their first year in Vegas, I think John Gruden and those guys, they will be looking to make a splash here. And if you're looking for anything to indicate that, 3 of the first round picks were wide receivers. And the other picks they had in between and right after that, 2 feisty corners. So true to style for Gruden. They also made a few nice moves on defense quietly with linebackers Corey Littleton and Nick Kwiatkowski, in addition to safety Demarius Randall, who I think will complement very well what they have in one of their first round picks from a year ago, and Jonathan Abram. Looking at the quarterback, who oftentimes there are rumors about, I think for Derek Carr, it's kind of a make or break year. It's not like he played poorly in either one of the 2 years he's had under Gruden, but his unwillingness to push the ball downfield, it's kind of maddening to me, and it could take away some of the splash that I've been talking about. I mean, last season, he averaged just 6.3 air yards per attempt, and he threw the ball 2.3 yards short of the sticks on average, despite ranking in the top half of the league in terms of times in the pocket being clean. So I still believe Gruden and those guys, they will rely more upon this big offensive line, and what I think should have been the offensive rookie of the year in Josh Jacobs, riding him and really controlling the games with the rushing attack. And I don't love all the pieces they have on defense, but just in general, they have the bodies. I think if they can be coached up by Paul Gunther going into the third year under him, that defense is ready to take another step as well. The one position, however, that I do look at being worthy of a replacement is that weak side linebacker. Hopefully Wonders Perfect is finally out of the league, and he's not part of that mix. And like I mentioned already, Mike Mayock did bring in 2 very underrated players at the linebacker level in Corey Littleton, who can be a super rangy Mike backer, and then Nick Kwiatkowski, whose physicality makes him a natural fit at the strong side. However, the Raiders did lose Tahir Whitehead to the Panthers in free agency, who was their starting will last year. You look at guys like Markel Lee, he's slipped quite a bit since a promising rookie campaign, playing less than 7% of his defensive snaps last season. And then Nicholas Morrow, who played very poorly for them when he was in a starting role last season. Maybe Gunther plans on using one of the mid-round picks in Tanner Muse more at linebacker already on base downs, since that is where I project him to play on sub-packages anyway. He has the ability to play as a will if he can just add a little bit of weight. Just hasn't had those true box duties at Clemson, even though he played all over the map. And the final team of these breakdowns, the Los Angeles Chargers. And these guys, they have one of the most talented rosters in the entire league. Once again, excellent core of skill position players, an improved defense with studs at every level. I mean, you look at this defense, find me a hole. I just don't know where it would be. Now that you bring back Derwin James back healthy, Chris Harris Jr. being brought in from the division rival Broncos, and then they traded back up into the first round and bring in Kenneth Murray out of Oklahoma, who's a super rangy linebacker as well and can run around and make plays for them. I love the fact that Chargers decided to give Austin Ekeler his due and make him an even bigger part of the offense, because he really came through for them whenever he was relied upon last season. We're still seeing how this quarterback situation pans out with Justin Herbert challenging Tyrod Taylor. But Taylor seems to be the starter heading into week 1. And if this team can play well, he could keep Herbert on the bench for most of the season actually, despite being the 6th overall pick. When I look at this team, even with some additions on the O-line, the one spot that I think they still need some help at is the left tackle position. They bring in a Pro Bowl guard in Trey Turner in a trade for the often injured Russell Okung. Then they signed Brian Bulaga to one of the more reasonable deals in all free agency as one of the premier right tackles in the league still. And then you have Mike Pouncey returning from injury. So just in terms of additions and subtractions, they are definitely better. And I think they might be set up better at 4 of those 5 spots than they have been for a while now. But who protects the blind side of Taylor and or Herbert? Sam Tevy? Trey Pipkins? I mean, to me, those are very underwhelming options. Tevy has been responsible for 11.5 sacks and 7 flags over the 29 starts he's had over these last 2 seasons, while Pipkins was brought in as more of a developmental player, and he's had major issues when he was out there. 3 sacks allowed and also flagged 3 times on just 250 total snaps. Like I mentioned already, overall this offensive line definitely better, but having that one liability still, it can wreck an offense because they constantly have to slide the protection his way, and especially with the Chargers, how do you want to keep only 5 in protection and have that back out in the route, especially if you have Ekeler out there? That can create some issues for them. So that is it. All 32 teams we've broken down in detail now. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more from me, and stay tuned not only here on this YouTube channel, but also on my page, halilswithfootballtalk.com, and all the social media channels that you can see linked below. I will be back next week with some of the biggest breakout players in the league right now. Keep your eyes on this channel. I'll keep you entertained throughout the offseason. So until then, see you later. Peace.